there you go. Usually we don't have time to cover all the questions. So if you don't have time to ask yours, just go on Twitter, and I'm sure Tom will, if he has time, try to answer some of them as well. Okay, and also do make sure that you tweet about this talk so that all the teachers that are not able to join today can learn from this talk too. Okay, so Tom, over to you, please.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining. We're up to sort of 690 people, which is amazing. So really, really great to see the level of interest there is in this. I'm just going to share the screen now, so most of it you'll see this. That's the one. So hopefully you'll see the slides there. And the talk I'm going to give is based around the idea that I developed for this book, The Learning Rainforest, of Mode A and Mode B teaching. And that's the basic idea. But I'm going to build up to sort of explaining where that came from. So the first thing is to sort of talk about the Learning Rainforest itself. We started off by, I'm going to, hopefully this will work for me, come on. Oh, I'm struggling to actually control my slides now. There we go. So the rainforest itself came from the idea that plantation thinking can sometimes be restricting if we assume that learning and teachers all have to be identical, and excellence can only take a certain form. It's not as sort of empowering to everybody compared to what I call rainforest thinking, which is where we talk about excellence taking many forms. So that's the basic principle of the Learning Rainforest, that we're trying to get students to excel without mandating precisely the way that that's done. And that applies to the way teachers teach, and teachers teach in a variety of different ways, all of which could be considered excellent. And it's partly related to this idea that teachers have to enact their practice themselves in their own classrooms, but what they need to do is to have wisdom that is informed by their own practice, but also from evidence. And it's the synthesis of these two things which makes you a really effective teacher. And our values, the things we believe in, are part and parcel of that. You can't really separate a person from their values. But what we can is we can shift our values in response to evidence as we learn new things. So when I'm doing training on this, I often talk about this, what is learning? What do we think it is? Do our values count? And this image I always like, which comes from a slide made in the 1920s, which imagines learning in the year 2000. It is on l'an 2000 there, and imagines kids sort of downloading. This is very relevant for our kind of current situation, isn't it, where people are kind of at home doing online learning, and the teacher there, the head teacher is, I say head teacher because I once met a man who was a head who looked exactly like that, where you're selecting the text and putting it into the hopper. So we do have to choose the curriculum often, but we don't just download learning. It doesn't really work that way. So we have to think about what learning looks like, how it works, and what is in there. And our values come into play very significantly. So I explore this in the book, The Learning Rainforest. There are 2 whole chapters on this. There's this whole debate between progressive and traditional values, which are important, and how that influences our decisions about the curriculum. So, if you haven't read those sections, sometimes people just skip straight to the end where it's all about practical strategies, but those chapters are there to read in more detail. I often, when I'm doing training face-to-face, I use some slides, and I encourage other people to imagine what their slides would be for their school. This was from a school where I was the head a few years ago. And these are pictures I took going around, seeing things happening that I used to think I liked. So I was selecting photographs of things that I value about my school at the time. And this selection indicates a few things. So you've got on the top left there, some students doing a group presentation for their Global Perspectives course. So it was very rigorous academically, but it was also collaborative. They had to present together. They had to do a lot of research. They had to write an extended assignment. And then they were being grilled quite forensically by their tutor. And they were supported as a student there on the right there, who was in the year above them, who had done it the year before. So they were being mentored by an older student. So that was all part of the mix. On the top right, you've got a food tech lesson. And that was done in a very traditional way. So technology at that school had this feeling of the early years of, say, year 7 or 8 were very formal. They were taught, don't go off and design a recipe or a piece of woodwork in resistant materials. It was make it just like this, exactly like I tell you, so that you can do it well. But if you went into the workshops in year 10 or 12, you'd find them designing all kinds of stuff. We had students sort of designing remote control, robots and incredible, pieces of furniture because they had the skills to do it. So it was about a pathway from tight, controlled, precise skill development, up to creative, expansive learning later on a longer journey. At the bottom left there, you've got some students who look like they're writing an essay. So what's the big deal about that? Well, the big deal about that was that just before that, the teacher had got them working in groups of 3 with a very specific question they were all given that was their own. And then they had to stand up and recite their answer to that question as a sort of a paragraph. And the teacher had designed that set of questions so that when they spoke their answers out loud, it kind of added together to create this whole narrative about the piece of history they were doing. And so they had all effectively spoken an essay together. And it's very effective. So it got the sort of essay writing off the page. So it was very knowledge rich, but it was also blended Orosi and a kind of discursive aspect to it. So it was very clever and embedded lots of different things within a context of a quite a serious topic. And the bottom right there, was photographed from house drama. Part of what we considered our curriculum was house events, which were student run. So it had a student leadership aspect. And we would kind of said, as I said, that was the curriculum. It wasn't extracurricular, it was the curriculum, because we suspended normal lessons and everybody went to the hall to watch several hours of drama performance. And it was in a competitive environment, which gave it a kind of edge. But things like that and the house music that went with it were strongly student-led and were an outlet for a lot of students' talents, which they didn't get elsewhere in the curriculum. So this was one of the things that we valued. And the final example is this. We call this, well, it was basically reading aloud and recitation. It was a big part of the school. So here you've got a photograph from a project where students learnt poetry by heart in English and French, and in Latin, actually. And they had to recite their poems. And why did we do that? We didn't do it because there's a study which says poetry recital leads to X and Y qualifications or whatever. We did it because we wanted to, because we believed in it, because we felt it was a good thing. So our value system at that school said, reading aloud and learning by heart are good things. And so we put them into the curriculum. And there was a rigor to all of these things. None of these things were sort of soft or woolly. There was a depth and it was hard work. Some of the students found it incredibly hard to recite their poems in Latin. Why did we do it? Because we think, well, why wouldn't you want to learn a poem off by heart? It's an amazing feeling to recite a poem that you just know. How wonderful if every child knew more poems that they could just say. So this is important, that values play a part in your curriculum design, and it's inescapable that that's the case. So in the Learning Rainforest, I'll explore some of these sort of cliches around what progressive teaching is. I'm not going to leave this slide up for too long, but you'll see it when I share it later, and traditional. And in the book, I explore how kind of both of them annoy me. Sort of, I can't stand it when people are kind of ferociously one-sided on this and sort of can't contemplate the idea. Even when people get annoyed about kids sitting in rows. I even saw the other day someone referring to kids in rows as draconian. And I just think, you're really losing the plot there. And I want to see everyone's face. They can face me, and that's great. Or opposite, group work. Group work can't possibly be good. Well, again, that annoys me, because of course it can. And that, in fact, collaborative learning has lots of bonuses. We'll come on to that in a second. So I've always looked for things which link things together, like Trivium 21st Century. If you've never read this, read Martin Robinson's epic book. It's brilliant. It blends traditional ideas about grammar, knowledge, with dialectic exploration and rhetoric. How do you communicate ideas? It's a superb way of linking ideas about curriculum and teaching together in a very coherent philosophical kind of way. I love that book. And that was inspiring to me when I was thinking about how to embed ideas from research into a curriculum mindset. And that's where the Learning Rainforest really came from. It's this idea of my values about what I think, plus the evidence from research into some guiding principles which say, okay, this is how to deliver in the sort of subtitle, great teaching. So in my sort of model, I use this tree in the rainforest. Each student is represented by kind of this tree, which is where you create conditions for them to learn. And what you want to get to is this thing of exploring the possibilities. You're after this sort of lush canopy of excellence in multiple forms. But the thing I say over and over again is you don't get to that. You don't get to the point where students are excelling, independent learners capable of doing their own thing, unless you build the knowledge for them to do that. So you've got to be disciplined in building the knowledge structure for students to know and understand things to the point, which is necessary in order for them to genuinely become independent. And if you short circuit that, if you go too quickly to the this idea that, well, we want kids to be in charge of their own learning, where they don't really know enough to guide their own learning well. They end up with a shallower outcome. So you've got to have both of this in mind. And sometimes it's about the sequence and the blending of them. So some examples. So when you're planning your curriculum, you know, it's how do we learn about insects, so for example? Well, you can study them in an abstract way and learn the terminology to describe them. But they're also real living things which you want to see with your own eyes. And the experience of seeing them in their own habitat is part of a complex scheme of forming experience for knowing what insects and how they behave. I often use this example from physics about, say, learning how motors work, where there's a technical, conceptual framework which, you know, has equations and stuff in it, which don't really make much sense unless you've had the tactile physical experience of making a motor and seeing how it behaves. It's the combination of the two, the knowledge which is tacit, which is experiential, plus the formal knowledge which has to be taught in an instructional way to be really effective. So how do we get a curriculum and a teaching mindset which allows students to have this? And this is where the mode A, mode B sort of thing comes from. So building the knowledge structure, I've got loads of strategies for that. And essentially, I started thinking, well, how do I distinguish between instructional teaching and other things? And I called it mode A teaching. So it's essentially instructional teaching. Every teacher at some point needs to be instructional. So it's a universal requirement that teachers need to be able to explain things to kids. It's about how much. So explaining well, modeling, getting kids to practice, giving them feedback, testing they can do the things you've taught them. All these things are staples of instructional teaching, which is part of the whole matrix. But of course, it's not the only thing. So as well as the mode A, you've also got the mode B, which is getting the kids to explore things, discover things, touch things with their own hands. And for me, it's not about one thing being better than the other. It's about what's the most appropriate blend of these types of teaching to get the best outcome. I found that very useful for people, rather than boxing yourself into this sort of slightly artificial polarity of one thing versus the other. It's actually much more subtle. How much instructional teaching do I need to do? It could be nearly 100%. It could be much less, depends on the learners, depends on the curriculum, depends on your context. So let's have a look at this to begin with. I mean, this is where all the cognitive science really kicks in, you know, explaining well, building schema, memory, cognitive load theory. These things really help us understand why it's so important to build schema really, really carefully, why instructional teaching is so important. So you need to really carefully make sure students understand things, challenge misconceptions, and so on. Break things down into small steps, make sure you're not explaining too many things at once. This is where the responsive teaching comes in, where people like Dylan William, Graham Nuttall's Hidden Lives of Learners, Barrett Rosenshine's Principles of Instruction, they lead to the sense that instructional teaching isn't one-way traffic. It's absolutely not. It's completely interactive. You can't teach in an instructional way effectively unless you have got the skills to interact with your class and get lots of students engaging. So I always find this something I have to stress quite often in some of my training, which is that instructional teaching isn't all about the teacher talking the whole time. It's teacher talk is really important. It has to be good and effective, and lots of explanatory talk is really, really important. But you need to find out whether the students have understood, and so it has to be interactive, and that's really important that we're not sort of, you know, getting confused there. This often helps in training when we have a model for this schema building process and we're thinking about long-term memory and the power of retrieval practice and so on. It's really important, and that's where mode A teaching is so key. Having a sort of theoretical model helps explain its power, and where the principles of instruction are so useful in delivering instructional teaching really, really well. But that's mode A teaching. This is where a lot of the time you're instructing, explaining, and this is the kind of where Rosenshine's principles come into play. Even he says himself, these principles apply when you've got a sort of quite a strong knowledge content that you need to explain to your students who are relatively novice, and some subjects need this more than others. I mean, he says it himself. You know, it's not like some conspiracy that Rosenshine's principles don't apply universally to all things, because no, he would have said that himself. So what about the rest though? So how do we, if we've got knowledge, we've built it well, we've got kids with basic secure knowledge that we've done through our instructional teaching, what do we do with that? You know, and sometimes this is the bit where I find teachers, they want to get to it, but they're not quite sure how much to do, or they sometimes do it too soon. But it's really important to have this mindset, I think, that what we're after is kids going off and learning. And I've taught lots of students over the years who are very, very capable of having ideas about what they want to learn, about what interests them, and about and I think that's important to recognize that that's real. You know, it's not, when sometimes people are denying this about, they're weird, they say, well, kids don't know what they know. Well, I say, well, no, they don't all, but some of them do. You know, some of them really do. And some of their ideas are great. You know, why don't you ask them? I've had the experience of, say, teaching RE with year 7s, where I said to them, what do you think we should learn about Christianity? And they gave me 20 questions we should answer. And I looked at my scheme of work and it was the same. There was 11-year-olds were telling me exactly what we should be studying without me having to tell them any of it. So yes, kids can have ideas, and we should be looking for what their ideas are and involving them in their own learning to the greatest extent that is reasonable. So Mode B teaching has lots of forms. And I'm just going to give you some examples. In the Learning Rainforest, I have this set of examples here, and in the books that I'm just doing now, the walkthroughs that I'm doing with Oliver, we have a section in there called Mode B teaching. So if I look down that list, it says collaborative learning, includes inquiry projects, open response tasks, lots of Orosi, the idea of pre-reading, reading ahead before you teach. In the new book, which I just started writing literally today, I started writing book 2. It's going to have more Mode B teaching, more Orosi, self-directed learning. Now, what does that look like? I use the analogy of skateboarding quite extensively in that, and how to make the most of visits and stuff. So there's lots of different aspects to it. One thing that comes up a lot is Orosi, getting kids to speak. This is links to Martin Robinson's Trivium, the rhetoric. You can't just hope kids develop Orosi, which means, you know, very broadly, it's the power to speak in lots of different ways. It's quite a broad term. Some people don't like the term Orosi, but you can't. My experience is that these things don't happen in schools by osmosis or by hoping. They happen because you plan them, and they're kind of embedded, and they're universal. They're entitlements that everyone gets. So things like this, which is some of the things that I've done in my previous work, getting kids to do formal speeches, for example, take some planning. So there's a writing element to that, and then they have to perform it, and getting them to give a speech from memory about something they're passionate about. This is one of the most beautiful things I've ever done in the school, is hearing kids in year 8, in this thing called Project Soapbox, stand up and talk for 5 minutes about something they cared about from the heart. You know, everyone's in sort of tears in their eyes at the back of the hall, hearing these kids talk passionately about the things they cared about. It's absolutely wonderful. And, you know, but yeah, to get 200 year 8s to give a speech in front of an audience takes some planning. So you've got to make that happen, and you've got to think it matters enough for you to do that. We had it as part of a whole plan. So we mapped out across the curriculum, where does speaking naturally happen? And we found out actually happens in loads of places. There are debates, there are recitations, there are presentations, there are all sorts of ways kids can have opportunities for speaking, and make sure, but what we had to do was make sure those were universal, not just for the kids who happened to have the teacher who was keen, or for the students who opted in. It was, well, no, we're going to make this something everybody gets, or else it's not really part of our curriculum. What about group work and projects? It's a pointless debate saying projects work and group work works or don't work. It's a bit like saying homework is good or bad. It depends on how well it's done and what it is. So, and the research is quite clear around group work, that collaborative learning done well is very, very effective in terms of the gains in learning for everyone involved. But the problem that the same researchers like Robert Slavin and people like him have suggested is that too often group work isn't done in that way. It's done poorly. So lazy, sort of shoddy group work can be very poor. It can be excellent. So you have to do it well, and you have to do it therefore a bit more selectively, because if you do it too often, you tend not to have the structures, and then the students, you know, it can be better for them to have done it on their own. So we need to have structure and really some precision around how we do group work, so that it is properly collaborative learning from which everyone benefits. I often use as an example of my training, which you may have heard me talk about before, which is the legendary T-shirt lesson, where, you know, if you get a group of kids to draw this circulatory system and the organs of the digestive system on a T-shirt, and say, off you go in your groups, make a T-shirt. What happens is you have dominant behaviors, you have a couple of people doing most of the work, and you have, you know, 2 or 3 of them just sort of on colouring in duty, sort of. And I've seen this with my own eyes. The kids are just sort of spending 45 minutes shading in the liver with the red pen, and that was their learning. Whereas if you have a good collaborative learning process, everyone in the group needs to make sure everyone else in the group knows all of the material, and is therefore they're testing each other, they're quizzing each other, they're rehearsing, they're sharing each other's knowledge, because the group only succeeds if every single student in the group can demonstrate their knowledge and understanding of what they're doing. And it's a totally different process with a rigor to it. So collaborative learning that is done in that way, where effectively, you know, the weakest link in the group needs to be the measure of success. That is what you need to be doing. So collaborative learning as a mode B thing is brilliant, provided it's done with that level of rigor. These are some examples of it, you know, where you've got the global perspectives course I mentioned earlier, or a media studies project. This was actually one that my son did, which was 4 students making a video. It took them hours and hours of time. It was very effective. It was high challenge, and they all had learning goals within that. And I thought that was an effective example. Open-ended projects. Some people think projects are problematic because, of course, there's a resource issue. And if you're just saying, off you go and do a project, you know, that can add to disadvantage, because if students don't know how to do a project, or it's unstructured, or they don't have the resources, you end up with the most advantaged kids doing the best and benefiting the most. So you have to attend to that. You have to give them resources, structure, guidance, and you have to set a standard for what excellence will look like. But in my experience, this has been some of the most wonderful work I've ever seen, literally in every school I've worked in, has come from when the students have been asked to respond in a form that they have chosen. So they've had a choice. And so we used to do this in my last 2 schools, go to the British Museum, which is free, and do a project as a response. And we used to get extraordinary work. And the first year you do it, you get extraordinary work and a whole pile of dross. So you have to say, well, let's not have the dross. Okay, guys, look, let's learn. This is what excellences look like and discuss it. And then empower kids to actually work out how to do exceptional responses. But kids they can make videos, they can make websites, they can give speeches, they can produce beautiful artifacts, which you wouldn't mandate to everybody, but they have value. So I think open-endedness, this is a wonderful way of, now how many times do you have to do this in a year? Well, not too often, even once. One of these projects, per year, significant. It's probably going to be all you need. You don't have to do lots of it. So mode B teaching can be quite small in volume, but packs a punch in terms of its impact. These are some of my favorite ones. It's wonderful. Papyrus, this boy, 11 years old, made this beautiful booklet. Wonderful. Here's one of my favorite examples. These boys, when I taught RE, they said to me, aged 11, we finished our introductory unit to Islam, and they said to me, well, can we make a website, and to show our learning? And I said, well, I don't know, can you make a website? And they laughed at me. They said, well, yeah, of course we can make a website. We did it in year 4. So they were quite cocky about it. So I said, well, okay, show me your website. And they made this beautiful website here. Welcome to Embracing Islam. And here it's got them with embedded videos of them explaining the 5 pillars of Islam. Fantastic. It looks a bit rough and ready, but it was really, really packed with insight. It's even, and then the next was an introductory unit to Christianity, and the same boy said to me, can we make another website at the end? So I said, go for it. So here we have, from the award-winning creators of Embracing Islam, welcome to our second website. This is absolutely awesome. It's got a tab in there called Comparison with Islam. So these boys, aged 11, have written this whole tab comparing Christianity with Islam. Now, I would never have dreamt of saying everyone make a website, because not all the students would have, but they could, so that the structure allowed them to. And from that, and other students did other things. This is what mode B teaching feels like. It has this sort of flexible openness, which supplements the rigor of the kind of instructional teaching, and they go together. Getting students to teach things. I've always felt that it's the students who should be up there holding apparatus, doing the talk. And why? Because they can, and because they enjoy it. So it's been an absolute staple as a science teacher. Wherever possible and wherever safe, the students are the ones that handle the apparatus in a demonstration, not me. And so how do I do it? Well, I get the students up front to say, it's your go next week or next month, you're going to do that demo. They practice it, they rehearse it, they learn about it, and then they deliver it to the class. It's not some sort of game, it's proper. They are the ones doing the demonstration and not me. And it's very, very powerful, because obviously I'm there giving my insight, but they feel this sort of confidence building. This is mode B teaching. It's very exciting to do it. Having tech teams. I used to think having a sidekick team was great. Having kids who can, not just doing the time of online learning, but generally having students who record your lessons and put it on a shared platform, very, very useful. They do all of the work, not you. You just say, who's the tech team this week? Okay, you guys, right, can we make the notes, share it with the class? They organise it all, and if you ask them to, you'll find that they can. And getting students to explain things. So lots of instructional inputs, again, rehearsed, practiced, they do it better and better the more they do it. And it becomes a normal part of the flow of lessons. At some of the time, students are invited to explain things to the class. If you hardly ever do it, it hardly ever happens, and it can be weak. If you do it quite regularly, it becomes part of the flow, and students get a lot from it. And probably one of the best examples I've ever done of this was students teaching each other. So this was like students literally teaching computing to younger students because they knew about it, and we used to build that into the curriculum. So I've written about that elsewhere. So there you go. Mode A teaching is massively important. Everyone needs to do it well. Mode B teaching is a part of, gives you this richness and this exploring the possibilities. As a physics teacher, I used to say, well, probably that's about my split. Most of the time it's me, instructional teaching, mode A teaching, and about 20% of the time I do these other things, and that's the blend. And you'll find your own blend in your own context, which makes sense to you. So hopefully that's gives you a sense of it. Hope that makes some kind of sense to you. It's got a loose kind of structure, but it gives me gives a framework to discussing the idea. So thank you very much for listening to that. And now I can take your questions. I'll stop the sharing.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Tom. That was absolutely fantastic. I definitely enjoyed it. And there are lots of questions. So I'm going to tell people that I'm going to start by reading the questions that were asked during the presentation, but do carry on asking, and I'm going to ask those afterwards. All right, so we kind of queuing them. So just check it from one of your last slides that you said 80% usually for mode A, 20 for mode B. Somebody asked before, what do you think would be the perfect balance for when we go back to school, considering we've gone through all this lockdown phase? Is it anything gonna change?
Yeah, I sort of feel like that it's really important when you put numbers up that you do it in context. So I'm there saying this is kind of how I feel very, very loosely about myself as a physics teacher over time. Yeah. When you go back to after the lockdown phase, well, I think the first thing you're going to do is lots of talking. I mean, because that's what you've missed. Lots of discussions, reviewing what you've done over the time during lockdown. And it might be that you've already done before and not so much new instructional input about new content. That's going to come a little bit later. So I'd say to begin with, you want to give students a chance to sort of show what they know, show what they've understood, so that you're doing a bit of a catching up process. So I think, yeah, probably the first week or so back, or maybe even month, might feel slightly differently. Things that they couldn't have done at home. So if there's any practicals and I think the worst thing you could do is probably just go into a sort of fairly dry kind of thing, which only replicates what they've already been doing. The stuff they haven't been able to do while they've been at home may be the thing to start with. But that obviously, gosh, I mean, you're talking about all age groups, all subjects. That's a very broad generalization. So you need to sort of find your way with that, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, so you talked in the beginning about values, and then the questions were whose values? Is it the teacher's values, the school values, the community values?
That's a brilliant question.
Yeah.
I think the schools have value. Everyone has values, or anyway, I mean, that's important. We all have our value system, and a good school will understand that values have to be constantly nurtured, and we have to kind of foster a sharing of that. So you have a community, you have discussions between teachers, between parents and teachers, between students and teachers, and it's part of you over time, you form a school which has got a strong set of traditions, which could be all sorts of different ones. That's emerged over time, and then new people who join that community kind of come into a school with existing values which are quite clear. And I found that when I went to that school, which was a school in Chelmsford grammar school, where, for example, one of the values there was reading aloud. Poetry and literature were all spoken aloud. The kids were always acting out their poems and acting out the texts and the plays. If you went into the English department there, you would struggle not to do that because it was so embedded in the culture there. So if your value system was, oh, I don't really like that, it's more sort of, you would probably have to have adapted. So I think their value systems are always dynamic. They're never static. But I do think there are things where you need to take a line as a school, say in a team, let's say as a science teacher, or let's say a maths teacher. what role does maths investigation play in your curriculum? Well, is it up to each teacher to decide? I don't think it is. I think it's up to the maths team in combination with the school leaders to say, at what point is it best for some form of investigative work to happen? And it could be just a tiny amount of it at this point.
Yeah.
Or it might be a whole approach. I mean, I know some schools where they think that's how they begin. And so it definitely has to be collaborative and collegiate, or else you have this weird thing of the randomness of your teachers deciding what school you go to. And I don't think that's the best way.
Yeah. There was actually a question about how important it is that this is like a school policy that every subject, all teachers are doing it. So I think you just answered that it is important that we go for all teachers.
Yeah, well, I think when it comes to a policy thing, I mean, the variation, what I want to say is that for this mode A, mode B has to be authentic for each subject. So
yeah.
it would be weird. And also the numbers are very, they're just nominal, aren't they? So I would be saying, where's the Orosi? Where's the collaborative learning? Where's the project in our curriculum overall? And it could be that one subject doesn't deliver any of those things because that's not what we agree. But in another subject, they actually do because it's more naturally fits there. So you have to be quite broad and holistic about this. It's not every subject does everything. I think that's hugely problematic. Otherwise you get sort of weirdly, oh God, we've got to do our stupid project thing that we've been made to do. That's a disaster. You've got to, it shouldn't feel like that. It should feel like it's authentic for your curriculum. But then as a whole school, you have to sit back and say, well, where do these things that we think are good things happen? And sometimes you do have to say, there are some gaps that we need to fill.
Yeah. So do you think it would help to have a joined up curriculum across subjects? Somebody asked that.
Yeah, definitely. So, once subjects have been designed, curriculum is designed from the bottom up with all the concepts within each subject, and each subject has got a sort of, it feels like it's, got its integrity as its own thing. It has to add up together as well.
Yeah.
And it can be that no one's, this is why Orosi and things like that can fall through the gaps because nobody thinks it's their job to do it. So it doesn't, they always think, oh God, I wish the kids were better at speaking. But or even something obvious as reading, the kids should do more reading. Oh, well, not in our subject, we haven't got time. That's not good enough. If everyone has to play their part in a whole school kind of process around a set of ideas like speaking, reading, collaborative learning, if you think those things are important.
Yeah. So there was some question about the experience part of the model. One, has there been any studies into the power role of experience in schema building? And the second one, is there an amount of experience that is more or less effective for students?
Well, this is a hard thing to say. So this is where it gets very subject specific. It's kind of there's lots of evidence around, say, maths being built around concrete resources. So, for example, so if you read Mark McCourt's excellent book Maths Mastery, he talks extensively about the use of Cuisenaire rods for developing a sense of fractions and adding numbers and partitioning and so on. So you can see there that there's a rationale for hands-on experiential learning to form schema around something maths, which then becomes heavily abstracted later. So I think that is well understood, and it's just a sort of an obvious thing that if you can't really build a schema which is abstract without concrete examples. So that's also been a studied thing. So if you're as a science teacher, you can't really, if you're told that metals react with acids to make hydrogen. Well, what is a metal? Give me an example. What acid? Unless you've seen that, that can be just like words without the experience of having seen it. It doesn't mean having done it with yourself. So, for example, I watched a video earlier on television about chemistry, and for me, the learning was in seeing it happen. I didn't have to physically do it myself, but it's seeing things with your own eyes is an important part of learning abstract ideas, of course. So, I think that is well studied. Of course, different subjects have got different dimensions of that, and sometimes, for example, in languages as a communicative subject where you have to practice speaking. Clearly, that's a different philosophy from one which is sort of heavily about sort of analytical, grammar based. So some of these things are not researched as like there's a study that proves. They are kind of self-evident, or they are values driven, that they are choices.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's a good answer. So there are questions about, you have worked in several schools. So some schools are in different areas, different backgrounds, different types of students. Do you think those ideas with the exploring possibilities and the projects, do they work well in every type of school with kids from all sorts of backgrounds?
Well, I think there are some situations where it's easier to assume things can be done than others. But one of the things that frustrates me is the idea, and I've debated this with various people, that, for example, there is a disadvantage factor in projects, because if they rely on lots of parental supervision to be done, plus resources at home like internet access and books, and even physical resources like paper and glue, some kids don't have that. So you've got to think, is the project that I'm setting actually doable? But sometimes you have to sort of push. So one of the things that we found with the British Museum project was that if you gave people 6 months and we almost mandated it, that you have to go, we were pretty much forcing people to go to the British Museum.
Mm-hmm.
And that was amazing. The feedback we had from that was phenomenal. And if you hadn't made me do it, I would never have gone. And it's blown my mind. And that was the parents talking. You know, it was the first time for some of the families they'd ever gone to a museum with their kids. And we were proud of that. So we thought, well, yeah, it's a bit awkward to have the conversation, but we are actually forcing you out of your, you know, and so, because we thought it was a good thing. So we would actually face the music in terms of, are you really mandating what I do with my family at the weekend? We'd say, yeah, yeah, we are.
Yeah.
Once. It's not, and we think in the balance of the relationship between school and home, we think that's a fair ask. So you do have to think about it. Are you asking your kids to do things they can do, all of them? And if it's only selective, if it's only, well, some of them can access it, like we're struggling now with the online learning, you know, a lot of kids still now are in schools where they're expected to access stuff online, which they patently can't access. And those are the things which are barriers. But should you then go the opposite way and say, it's too difficult for us, therefore no projects? I think no. I think that's sort of slightly patronizing to say, you're effectively saying you're too poor to be set a project, more or less. I mean, I find that kind of difficult to deal with. I'm saying, no, okay, what are the barriers for you to engage with this project? How do we help you overcome those barriers and have that approach? But it does mean, therefore, that those projects need to be very well designed and probably fewer, like, because we're going to be really make them high stakes. Everyone's going to do this project and it's going to be good, thorough, well-resourced, and we're going to make it high. If it's just lots and lots of homeworks, which is just open-ended, I don't think that can be very problematic in some situations. The other one is, say, Orosi. I've met teachers in schools where people would say, well, our kids just wouldn't do that. And you think, well, my response to them, slightly in their face, is, well, I know that they won't do it because you're saying they won't. Like, unless you actually think it can be done, of course it won't happen. If you're literally saying our kids can't do X, well, that's it. That's barrier number one. Your own limitation is the barrier. Yeah. If you imagine, would it be possible for our kids to be able to give speeches or do debates or run house music? Well, let's imagine what it would be like to get to that point. Well, we don't start by saying it can't be done, that's for sure. We start by saying, imagine in 5 years' time that our students were running house music totally independently. Wouldn't that be awesome? So how do we begin that? Well, we begin it by making it a goal, making it seem possible, getting a nucleus of kids together to get it going, and so on, and you find a way through it. You have to sort of be solutions focused.
Yep. So there are a lot of people asking for more examples. Well, you mentioned the skateboard example. Can you tell us what that is?
Yeah, so I used to do this whole skit, and I still do sometimes in CPD, about skateboarding lessons, and imagining how crap they would be at school. You know, so so you imagine when you go to a skate park, yeah, it's the kids are kind of exceptional at it often, and there's no one teaching them except they are emulating others. So they learn from what's possible. They see each other doing tricks, and half the time they fall off and they don't seem to care because they just pick it back up again. And they're kind of challenging themselves to do better because the goals are quite explicit. So they know what to do. They're trying to improve. And because they're in control of the whole thing, there's this high level of autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
They're flourishing in that environment. So sometimes I say, well, what would skateboarding lessons look like in a school where you'd get them all lined up? You would say, don't start till I go. You'd make them all put their helmets on, and it would crush the spirit out of it for the kids who could already do it. That's the kind of message. So I think, well, what's that? What that can be what it's like for some kids with some tasks at school. They already know more. They're already ready to fly off, and you're holding them back. They're saying, no, not till I'm ready. And it's all about what the teacher needs. So I have this idea of sort of what I call thresholds and pathways, which is one of the thresholds and pathways. So you've got to get everyone to the threshold. And once they're above it, they have pathways like, oh, you're ready to go. Who can already do this? Awesome. Right. Off you go. Who's not sure yet? Okay. So I need to help you get to that point. And that could be with all kinds of things. It could be maths problems. It could be with types of writing. It could be with all sorts of creative subjects. Some of the students don't go, and some kids don't go skateboarding because they can't do it. So the skateboarding parks only capture the kids who are already happy in that environment. So this is the issue. So I think we need to think about that in our lessons. Who in our lessons is just so desperate for me to shut up so they can get on? Well, who are they? Well, let me let them go. Let me release them. Who is scared by the whole thing that I'm teaching them and feels that they're surrounded by all these kids who know what they're doing? Well, I need to find out who they are and help them. So you have to have this sort of mindset of dealing with this variety, the kids who are ready to fly and the kids who need a lot of support to get to the threshold. And that's a kind of, that's what skateboarding essence is about.
Yep. That's very interesting. Also, what about the tech team? People ask you to explain a bit more about that.
Yeah, so what I discovered early on, as a teacher, was that as new tech platforms come on, and you've got things like Edmodo or you've got Google Classroom or whatever, is that it's a headache for me. I mean, to learn new systems the whole time, but the kids are just brilliant at it. So, and then you can either have a set tech team who just love it, or you can rotor it. But I would say, as a teacher, recruit your tech team early on because they love it. I know this has whole been formalized in some schools. They call them sort of digital leaders and so on. But so if you have sidekicks in any lesson who you can ask to upload to the system, share the homework, make sure the homework is logged, and do all kinds of stuff. Like I remember having kids with an iPad who would video my chemistry demonstrations, and within minutes it was on Edmodo, and the kids could play back the demo any time they liked. They used to love it. Yeah. I didn't do any of it. I didn't even know how to do it. They did it for me, and I found out that they could. So this is my idea of the tech team. Recruit early. Get the kids who know how to set up the interactive whiteboard, who can get the visualizer working when it goes wrong, who know how to reconfigure your IWB when it goes off cue or whatever. And they love it. They love the responsibility, and also they love the sharing. So if you have students who are happy to share, so I've had classes sort of mostly secondary, but all ages at secondary, who part of the kind of background to our lessons was there's a sort of sharing going on, where kids would find videos on YouTube and they would share it with the class and say, hey guys, this is really cool. This is about the topic. And of course you filter it and so on. And you get this culture of the kids feeling like their class goes beyond just your sort of slot in the timetable. It exists in the ether. And that's been possible for a long, long time. So I think having tech, having this sort of tech backdrop to your class as a place where kids can share things and have some ownership and responsibility is really, really great. It's hard enough as it is sometimes to find kids genuine roles and responsibilities in a school. But if one of them is the tech team, it really helps, I think, to just get kids feeling that sense of a 12-year-old or a year 5 who's responsible. They wear it like a badge of pride, and I think that means a lot.
Yeah. Somebody asked, what are your views on growth mindset?
Well, my view on growth mindset is it's as good as a concept in terms of the idea that you need to get students to believe they can do things rather than believe they can't. But I feel that generic messaging about growth mindset is not very useful. I think it's much more useful to be more subject specific about engineering success. That's my preferred thing, to say, how do I succeed in maths? How do I succeed in writing? How do I succeed in German? And through engineering success, you foster a growth mindset. You show that it's possible. You don't just urge them to believe it's possible. You say, like, so for example, with the skateboarding lesson, how do you get someone who's a reluctant skateboarder? You don't just say, come on, you can't do it yet, but one day you'll be doing, the half pipe. You say, well, let me engineer success. Just try this and try that. And you get them to see that by trying things in a safe way, they learn to succeed. And they start thinking, hey, maybe I can do it. So I'm more these days, more of an advocate for things like metacognitive talk. How do we know what we know, and that kind of thing. And so I think growth mindset messaging at a very general level is okay, but I don't think in itself it goes very far unless you are very, very subject specific in engineering success through strategies and so on. And that's how I feel that it's better placed.
Yeah. So just coming up from there, Kieran just asked now on the chat, do you think that engineering success should be a school-wide culture rather than department?
Yeah, I do, yeah. In fact, I'm firmly of the view that teachers should talk about growth mindset and understand it, but then what they should do is talk about how to engender it in their subjects, and the way to do that is to talk about their curriculum and how to break it down into success steps and how to succeed. And that is developing a growth mindset. If we get the students to believe they can do things by teaching them well, we will be fostering a growth mindset. That's how we do it.
Yeah. And
we're not going to do everyone in the hall for an assembly about growth mindset and think we've done growth mindset. That would just be kidding ourselves. So yeah, that's my view these days. Of course, that's no harm as well. I mean, telling kids in theory, like, this is the idea of a growth mindset, fine, but it's pointless if you're not doing the other bit. So that's the most important bit. In your subject, if a student's struggling, what are the technical curriculum and pedagogical things you do to engineer success? And those are the conversations to be having. Those are the more useful ones.
Yeah. So there are other questions about your opinion on knowledge organizer, your opinion on the flipped classroom model.
Okay, let me
I want to know what you think.
Flipped classroom. So it's funny. This is something which gets a bit bandied. It gets battered. Flipping, it becomes gets slagged off in the basket of groovy activities which don't really work. Well, I think that's the weirdest thing. I mean, partly because of my experience. So when I first started teaching, I taught in a sixth form college. So there's a context, of course. A sixth form college teaching A levels. How did we teach the entire course? Through flipped learning. So the first lesson was, here's a guide to organize your work. Read these pages, write these notes, try these questions, and deadline. So next week, all right, let's have a look. Let's have a look at your notes. Let's have a look at your reading. All right, so-and-so, tell me what you learned about this. So-and-so, tell me what you learned about that. What did you do with question 3? And so I hardly ever wrote on the board. It was the weirdest thing, because the students did that through the books. And I did most of my time going through questions, doing practicals, demonstrations. And we got phenomenal results. It was amazing. So for me, my experience has been that in a mixed, it was a sort of comprehensive sixth form in the sense that there was A levels, but there was no further selection. And it worked extremely well. And you train them. By the time you got to year 13, they were expert at it. They would be pushing you to Wednesday. They knew how to study extremely well because you had trained them up. So for me, when people slag off flipped learning, I just think, well, you just don't know what you're talking about something else then, because it's not the thing I'm thinking it is, which is basically giving students the tools to pre-read, to access information, and to bring that into the lesson to discuss and explore. Of course, it's combined then with instructional teaching when you do something new, and if you've got vulnerable learners who can't go home and read about adding fractions, of course you need to explain it to them. So you do have to think, who's it for then? When is flipped learning a good thing? It's not about is it good or bad. It's effective when you've got students who have the tools to read independently. And so therefore there is or to view material independently. And so you do have to have a threshold thing. And the other one was knowledge organizers. So knowledge organizers are useful as a tool for summarizing what you're supposed to know. That's basically what they are, aren't they? In themselves, they don't do anything unless you build around them retrieval practice techniques and get the students to learn how to use them as a reminder, as a cue for their study, as a sort of overview level guide as you walk your way through a topic. so producing the knowledge organizer is like 5% of the thing. The rest of it is using them as an embedded part of your teaching. And I've seen them used really well, where the students were able to turn them into things like cue cards or prompts for their learning. I've seen them used badly, where they were sort of literally laminated and they were brought out every lesson and put on the table, and the kids weren't even allowed to take them home. I just thought, what are you doing? You know, why have you produced this resource for kids, which you don't even trust them to own? That was the weirdest thing I've ever seen. You know, like, well, they'll lose them. Well, I thought that you didn't understand this whole thing, did you?
Oh, they are, yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, so it depends. It really depends on the quality of and the wraparound with them. In themselves, they are just one of many resources.
Yep. So there are questions about mode B. So if you're working with projects, is there a worry that kids will spend more time on the aesthetics, or like making it pretty, instead of on the actual learning?
Yes.
And then David asked, just generally, what are the potential pitfalls of mode B? What should we be having in mind when we're working with that?
Yeah, so that is a pitfall. So that comes through the things that you value when they're completed. So one of the things I always think is important is to have with a project is to have a knowledge goals that go with them. So the purpose of this project is so that you know and understand about this. And how do you demonstrate that knowledge? Well, you have to answer questions about it. So the process of the project isn't just to produce a thing, it's to produce a thing which, through doing that, gives you some knowledge. So you have an accountability that, for example, the students have to present it and answer questions. So they have to get ready to understand it. And also when you're valuing and you're doing criteria for excellence and saying, so what would an excellent project look like? Every project you ever set, I think, should start with, before you go off and waste hours of your time, what are you pitching for? If you're going to knock my socks off with your amazing project, what will you have done? How will you have achieved that? So you discuss other models of excellence, ideally more than just one variety. And you'll say, so why is an excellent project? It's not just because it looks nice. It's because the student knew about it. They talked about it. They could answer it. And you model that through what you're doing. So you've got to make sure that we're not just after prettiness. That can be a criteria. It's just part of it. Knowing things and being able to explain them is the goal. And you avoid that whole thing of the nonsense of the copy and paste from websites and stuff. Of course, you just deal with that straight away. Like, that isn't what I'm after. So you need to do that through modeling. These things are always easier the second time around. So you've got examples of, you know, why would I be not happy with this project? Can you see why? It's because, and you discuss it right from the beginning. Avoid all of this, and you discuss it explicitly. Which is why I come to the thing again, when you do these sort of projects, I think it's worth doing them when you've got them rare enough to invest that amount of time in them. So you have the pre-discussion, you show the exemplars, you have time afterwards to celebrate and consolidate, and you even have time in the middle to sort of push on and have interim milestones and stuff. So I think these projects like that work well, where they're done over quite a few weeks, sort of in the background to sort of other lessons maybe, and then you come back to them, rather than lots and lots of them, which can be, you know, kids just sort of tossing them out sort of without really just thinking, I just have to get this thing done. And then you have lower quality outcomes.
So Claire just asked about, when you're asking students to demonstrate practical experiments, do you train them beforehand on using the equipment, or do you let them just learn for themselves? And that, I think, matches somebody else's question, which was, when does directed learning happen? Is it before acquiring knowledge? Is it after acquiring knowledge, or self-directed learning?
It really depends. So with some of the students that I would do practical demonstrations, I mean, I would select certain things which are fairly easy to do. So for example, one of the photographs I showed is a ticker tape timer. Well, actually, if you're a year 10 student with an average, you know, reading capability, you can read the book about how it works. And you can. I mean, just try it. You know, the kids can learn how to use a ticker tape timer. What they need is half an hour in a classroom with the equipment to get used to it. That's all. So you give them that opportunity. You say, look, here you go, guys. See, you know, and you might have to spend a few minutes in helping them get going. So you have to get to. They definitely have to practice, and they definitely have to sort of have a time in advance to get used to it. Definitely, it's not. That's if you're being serious about it. If you just want a bit of a tokenistic, hey, just hold the apparatus while I do all the talking. Well, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a deeper level, genuinely expecting them. I used to go as far as this. I would say to those students, it's your lesson, and if you don't organise the equipment, and literally when they'd forget, I'd say, well, where's the stuff? You know, where's the lesson? It's your lesson. And I'd be cross with them for not having organised it, because they would think, oh, I was going to do it. And I say, no, it's your lesson. I told you it's your lesson.
Mm-hmm.
And you should have organised the equipment. So you have to have a culture where the expectations are high and they do read, but also then you learn ways of buying a couple of minutes here and there with them to sort of just check they're okay. And we had a tagging, always tagging. So they talk, I'd chip in, they say some more, I would add. So you have to build a culture around that where it's part and parcel of the normal thing that students participate in lessons, or else it becomes harder to do. So again, the more often you do it, better everyone gets at it.
Yep.
Yeah.
We kind of running out of time, unfortunately. There are still other questions. I don't think we're going to have time, as always, to go through all of them. So I can ask you a couple more, or we can just take this to Twitter.
Just ask me one more, because otherwise I think we'll lose people because it's at 4 o'clock. But just give me one more, and I'll go.
Yeah. So, do you think you mentioned something before? I'm just going to read the first one that shows up on my screen here. Using the great examples from students to motivate the other ones to do also good work. But somebody asked if the ones that haven't done the great examples yet, will they feel put off doing them because they feel like they won't be able to do something that nice or that good?
Yeah, so again, it's in the ideal scenario. It's useful to have examples of steps towards things. So if you've got an example of a piece of work, which is like, I've seen it's done really well with writing, with products like resistant materials products, or paintings in art, whole portfolios, where you say, look, this is what a student did, and it's the exceptional standard. But that can be overwhelming. So how did the student get to that? Well, let's have a look at where they began. This was their first effort. So you have the sort of the levels. So I do think one of the things you need to have with exemplars is steps. This is to where to aim for to begin with, and then if you're ready for that, go to this and then go to there. So if you just only ever show excellent examples, it's actually hard to see how to get to those. Just by showing somebody what excellence looks like doesn't make you able to do it. So you have to deconstruct all those things.
How to get there?
Where would you begin? You'd start with this and you do that. And if you get to there, that's not bad. But then even further is this. So having that sense of constant improvement and milestones is important. But just at a very simple level, seeing the scale, the size, the amount of, I often found that useful when someone's saying, writer, do something. Well, I always want to know, what does one look like that was done before? And you look at it and you go, oh, okay, so it's about that scale, that size, that's what I'm aiming at roughly. And it helps you sort of frame the whole process. But you do need to have, and you need to know your learners, don't you? Motivating students to show them what it could look like to have improved is often very useful. Not just showing them what someone else did. You have to sort of work with individuals as well. So that gets a bit more subtle about the nature of feedback and how students respond to that.
Yep. It sounds great. I think we're going to have to stop now. Thank you very much, Tom. That was absolutely great. I'm sure everybody appreciate that. There are lots of thank yous, if you can see on the chat. So
thank you for joining.
Do you want to let people know once again how to get in touch with you, how to get your book, and the book that you're working on right now, just so we finish this?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, teacherhead.com is my website, and there are links to there to the book on Amazon. Learning Rainforest is still going pretty strong, I'm glad to say, and nearly everything I've discussed is in there. And the walkthroughs, which has just come out last month with Oliver Caviglioli, has come out, and that's a whole thing. There's a website for that, walkthroughs.co.uk. And we're producing these training materials for schools. So, if you're in a school and looking at training, have a look at that website and join us along that as well. So thank you for supporting our work, and thank you for joining me today.
No, thank you. And thank you, everybody. And I'll see you all next Wednesday when we'll be talking about leadership with Emma Turner. So have a good day. Thank you, Tom.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.